Ma'am, I'm asking you one last time. Step out of my pool. Calvin's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. The calm in it was more terrifying than a shout. He stood at the edge of the deep end, arms crossed, shades on, badge tattoo peeking from beneath the edge of his shirt sleeve. And across from him, floating defiantly on a neon pink flamingo, was Karen. Hair dyed the brightest platinum blonde, lips pursed like she just sucked on a lemon, and sunglasses too big for her narrow face. Karen barely even glanced at him. "You don't own this neighborhood," she said coolly, tipping back her wine cooler. "The HOA does, and I am the HOA. Calvin didn't flinch. "Lady, this is my yard. That fence you squeezed through? Trespassing. You were warned multiple times." Karen let out a laugh, a fake, breathy, condescending sound. "You think I'm scared of some retired cop with a kiddie pool in his backyard? Please." And that's when Calvin moved. One sharp whistle, and out came Duke, a towering Great Dane with the body of a racehorse and the bark of a thunderclap. Karen shrieked, wobbling on the float as Duke barked once, then sat obediently. But that wasn't the lesson. No, the lesson came 2 minutes later, when the cops showed up. Not the local ones, his people. The ones who still owed Calvin favors from his 26 years on the force. What Karen didn't know yet was that this wasn't just a warning, it was payback. And what happened next? Well, let's rewind, because this whole storm started with a handshake and a smile. 3 months earlier, Calvin Jenkins had just retired. After nearly 3 decades in law enforcement, he was finally hanging up the badge. Everyone said he should have moved to Florida or somewhere coastal, but Calvin had his own dream, a quiet life in the suburbs, where he could grill steaks, tinker with his motorcycles, and watch sunsets from the back porch. So he bought the corner lot in Maple Grove Estates, a small gated community just outside Atlanta. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. At first, everything was fine. Neighbors waved. Kids biked past his lawn and shouted, "Hey, Mr. Jenkins!" One even brought over cookies, burnt to a crisp, but Calvin ate them anyway. That's who he was, the kind of man who fixed broken lawnmowers for free and kept extra jumper cables in the garage just in case someone's car wouldn't start. But every suburb has that person. And in Maple Grove, her name was Karen Whitmore. Karen didn't knock when she showed up. She walked straight into Calvin's backyard like she owned the place, heels stabbing the grass, clipboard in hand. "You can't paint your fence red," she announced before even saying hello. Calvin looked up from his tools, blinked once. "Ma'am, it's burgundy." Karen flipped her clipboard. "It clashes with HOA regulations, and your American flag? It's not regulation size." He smiled then, that same calm smile that made perps squirm in interrogation rooms. "Is that so?" She sniffed. "Don't play coy. I'm head of the HOA here, and I keep things in order. We expect a certain look." That was the first meeting. The second came a week later. Calvin was in his pool, built it himself, installed the tiles, wired the lights. Nothing fancy, just a modest rectangle with a deep end, waterfall feature, and a sign that said, "Swim at your own risk." He was floating peacefully when he heard voices. Laughter, high-pitched, dripping sarcasm. He opened his eyes and saw Karen, not alone, this time with 2 girlfriends. All 3 were in swimsuits, sipping drinks, and acting like his yard was a resort. Calvin got out slowly. "Did you mistake my fence for your front door?" Karen didn't even look embarrassed. "There's no rule that says HOA board members can't inspect the pool." "While drinking mojitos?" She shrugged. "Your gate was unlocked." He didn't yell, just handed her a towel. "Dry off, and don't come back." They didn't listen. In the following weeks, Karen returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, always uninvited. She'd climb the fence or wedge herself through a side gate. Calvin reinforced it twice, installed cameras, put up a motion alarm. She laughed, said he was paranoid. But this wasn't about rules, It was about control, and Karen didn't like that she couldn't control him. One afternoon, Calvin was sitting in his garage polishing his old revolver, not loaded, just a habit, when a neighbor stopped by. Jenny, a sweet single mom who lived across the street. She looked shaken. "Karen's been saying things, Mr. Jenkins." He set the gun down. "What kind of things?" "That you're threatening, that you scare people." Calvin chuckled. "I'm the one being trespassed on." "I know," she said quickly, "but people talk, and Karen, she has friends on the board." That night, Calvin checked the HOA newsletter. A line caught his eye. "Certain residents have been reported for aggressive conduct and non-compliance with community harmony guidelines." No names, but he knew. She was coming for him. But Calvin had dealt with bigger threats than neighborhood politics. He wasn't rattled, just disappointed. He didn't want trouble. He wanted peace. Still, it was clear. Karen wouldn't stop. Not until she was embarrassed, humbled, or better yet, exposed. And then came the final straw, a hot Saturday in July. Calvin had just come back from a morning ride, helmet in hand, boots still dusty. As he rounded the corner, he froze. There they were, again. Karen floating in his pool, her speaker blasting music, her wine cooler open, two of her friends lounging on his lawn chairs like it was a spa retreat. And the gate? Broken. They'd kicked it in. That was it. No more warnings, no more talks, no more subtle looks. He stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm asking you one last time. Step out of my pool." And now we're back where we started. Karen, pink float. Calvin, standing still. Duke, alert. But just as Calvin raised his phone and tapped the special contact, the one labeled Captain Brooks, APD, Karen looked up. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. He tapped it anyway. "I just did." And that's when sirens started to echo in the distance, faint but growing louder. Karen's smug look wavered. Then her float began to drift toward the deep end, but she couldn't swim, and that's when it happened. She slid off the float, arms flailing. And Calvin? He didn't move. He just watched, waiting for the moment to decide. Would he help her, or let the lesson sink in? Karen's scream sliced through the air, high and panicked, as her arms thrashed above the water. The pink float bobbed away uselessly, while her designer sunglasses flew off her face and sank. The deep end of Calvin's pool wasn't monstrous, but it was deep enough for someone who couldn't swim to get into trouble fast. Calvin didn't move at first. His arms remained folded, his face unreadable. The sirens were louder now, coming closer. "Help! Help!" Karen sputtered, choking on a mouthful of chlorine as she flailed in circles. Her two friends scrambled to their feet, one of them dropping her wine cooler in the rush. "She can't swim!" the brunette shouted from the lawn. "Do something!" Calvin tilted his head slightly. "I warned her, repeatedly." He took 2 slow steps forward, then, without rushing, he knelt by the pool's edge, extended the long-handled pool skimmer, and held it out. Karen latched onto it, coughing violently as he dragged her toward the shallow end. When she reached the slope and her feet touched the floor, she collapsed, soaking and wheezing, her hair matted to her face. She didn't say thank you. She just glared, humiliated. And Calvin just said, "That's lesson number 1. Before she could spit out whatever insult was boiling on her tongue, the gate swung open hard. 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop outside the fence. Officers stepped out, none of them local. These were state level, and they weren't in a hurry. Karen blinked up at them, water dripping from her mascara-heavy lashes. "What is this?" Captain Brooks, a tall black man with salt and pepper hair and a voice like granite, looked around, then turned to Calvin. "You called it in?" Calvin nodded. "Trespassing, property damage, and harassment. I've got recordings, 3 months' worth." Karen started to protest. "He's lying. This is my community. I'm the HOA chair. He's just bitter because— Ma'am, Brooks interrupted, eyes cool and sharp. No one's above the law, not even self-declared HOA royalty. Karen's mouth dropped open. Her friends backed away slowly, shoes squeaking on the wet tiles. Calvin glanced toward the lawn where Duke was calmly sitting, watching the whole thing like a judge in court. Mind if we step inside? Brooks asked. Be my guest, Calvin said. They left Karen dripping and stunned in the pool as the officers began gathering statements. The heat of the day beat down on her like justice served. But the truth was, this wasn't about the pool. This started long before the float, the drinks, the sirens. This started on Calvin's very first week in Maple Grove, when he tried to do something kind. Back then, he hadn't even unpacked all his boxes. The movers had just dropped off the last crate when he spotted a girl struggling to fix her bike chain near the sidewalk. She couldn't have been older than 10. He stepped out with a wrench in hand. Need a hand? She looked up, startled. Then she smiled. Yes, please. Her name was Lacey. She was Karen's daughter. Calvin fixed her chain in 5 minutes and walked her home. Karen had answered the door, took one look at him, and frowned. You touched my daughter's bike? He explained calmly. Karen didn't say thank you. She just muttered, Don't get too comfortable. And that was his first sign. From then on, she made it her mission to make Calvin uncomfortable. She filed noise complaints when he played jazz on his porch past 7 p.m. She sent letters warning that his welcome mat was too colorful. She even accused him of intimidating neighbors with his dog, who barely barked unless commanded. Most folks in the neighborhood liked Calvin. They'd chat with him during their walks, admire his motorcycle, ask him about his garden. But Karen had pull with the board, and she used it. She showed up uninvited to a barbecue he hosted for the block, told people they weren't allowed to gather without HOA approval, made veiled comments about security concerns. It was all passive-aggressive, but constant. Then came the official notices, complaints about unauthorized fixtures on his property, claims that his porch lights were too bright, and even a fine for not submitting pool installation paperwork properly, despite the fact it was signed and approved. It was harassment dressed in protocol. Calvin didn't respond with anger. He responded with paperwork. He documented everything, every encounter, every letter, every time she trespassed or threatened. He didn't retaliate, until now. Back at the pool, Karen finally pulled herself to her feet, drenched and fuming. She pointed at Calvin. You think this little show is going to scare me? Captain Brooks, still calm, walked over. Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us. This isn't a show, this is an investigation. I'm the victim here, she shouted, stepping barefoot onto the lawn. He lured me here. This is entrapment. Calvin sighed. You broke my fence, Karen. You broke in. You brought alcohol. You used my private pool as if you owned it. She stared at him, boiling with fury. Brooks handed her a towel. Let's go. You can tell your side at the station. As they led her away, she glanced back once, eyes sharp and wet. This isn't over, she hissed. Calvin watched her go, expression unreadable. He knew it wasn't over. But what Karen didn't know was what came next. Because while she was being driven away, someone else was watching the scene unfold. Quietly. From behind a curtain across the street. A man with slick hair, a sharp suit, and a file folder in his hand. He wasn't police. He wasn't a neighbor. And he wasn't on her side. That man made one short phone call, then walked away. And the next storm? It wouldn't be one Karen could walk out of so easily. 2 days after Karen was escorted from Calvin's property, Maple Grove felt unusually quiet. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved nervously when Calvin walked Duke. A few even crossed the street to greet him. About time someone stood up to her, whispered Mr. Lyle, the 70-year-old retiree who lived 2 doors down. Calvin just gave his usual nod, and kept walking. He wasn't the bragging type, never had been. But something about the air felt different now, like something deeper had cracked beneath the surface of this so-called perfect neighborhood. Karen, meanwhile, was not in jail. Of course not. She posted bail within the hour, her well-connected attorney making a dramatic fuss at the station. But now she was under official investigation: trespassing, property damage, harassment, and possibly even falsifying HOA citations. Still, she hadn't learned her lesson. Calvin found out the next morning when he opened his mailbox and pulled out an envelope. No stamp, no address. Just one word written in red ink: traitor. He turned it over. Nothing else, no signature, no note. But the handwriting, loopy, exaggerated, feminine, felt oddly familiar. Calvin brought it inside, slid it into a plastic evidence bag, and placed it on his kitchen counter alongside 3 others. Yeah, this wasn't the first. He knew it wouldn't stop until something bigger happened. Later that evening, he was sipping coffee on his back porch when the man from across the street, the same one who watched Karen being arrested, appeared at the edge of his yard. Tall, suave, mid-50s maybe, pressed navy suit, polished shoes. He didn't belong in a place like Maple Grove. "You're the ex-cop," the man said, not asking, stating. Calvin set his mug down. "Who's asking?" "Name's Henry Langford. I represent a firm that consults with neighborhood development boards, especially ones under legal review." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "HOA lawyers?" "Not exactly," Henry said, stepping closer. "More like cleanup crew. We handle high-risk board members before they become liabilities." Now Calvin leaned back, arms folded. "And you're here, why?" Henry smiled tightly. "Because Karen Whitmore has crossed a line too many times. She's a PR nightmare. And our firm's been hired by the investors behind Maple Grove to quietly investigate, then replace, board members creating too much noise." Calvin didn't reply, but Henry took that as an invitation to continue. "Thing is," Henry said, "you just handed us the evidence we needed. Video footage, witness reports, her arrest. You've done the hard part." "And what?" Calvin said. "You want me to what? Testify in secret, sign off on her removal?" Henry shrugged. "Not quite. Just stay out of the way. We'll handle her. But we may need access to some of your documentation. You're the only one who's been thorough." Calvin looked him up and down. "Why would I trust you?" "Because Karen's not just annoying," Henry said, voice lowering. "She's dangerous, vindictive, and she has access to records she's not supposed to. Financial ones, falsified fines, hidden payouts. If those come out publicly, Maple Grove crashes in value." Now that got Calvin's attention. He'd sunk most of his retirement into this house, into this neighborhood, into this supposed peaceful future. "I'll think about it," Calvin said at last. "That's all we ask," Henry replied, handing him a business card. "But make no mistake, if she gets desperate, she'll do something reckless." And reckless didn't take long to arrive. The next day, as Calvin drove to the grocery store, he noticed something strange. A black sedan behind him. Same one at every turn. He doubled back, made an extra loop, took a shortcut through a gas station. Still there. He parked at the far end of the store lot and walked calmly inside, eyes scanning the mirrors. When he came out 10 minutes later, the sedan was gone, but someone had keyed the passenger side of his truck. Deep. Angry. 4 long slashes. He looked around. No one in sight. No camera nearby. Just the message carved above the wheel well. "Stay silent." Later that night, a neighbor texted him. Someone had been snooping around his backyard again. He checked his cameras. 2 of them were disabled. Whoever it was, they were careful this time. But not careful enough. Because Calvin had planted a decoy camera. And that footage? It caught a figure in a hoodie. Slim. Wearing gloves. But when they turned toward the side gate, just for a second, the porch light caught their face. It wasn't Karen. It was Lacey, her daughter, the girl whose bike he'd fixed, who used to wave from the sidewalk, and now she was sneaking around his house in the dark. He paused the footage, stared at her frozen face on the screen. This wasn't just petty anymore. Karen had dragged her own child into her war. Calvin sat in silence for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, one labeled Backup Plan. He hadn't wanted to use it, not unless absolutely necessary. But now it was getting personal. And before the week was out, the whole neighborhood was going to feel the fallout. Calvin couldn't sleep that night. Not out of fear, but disappointment. He had always been the kind of man who believed kids should never be pawns in adult wars. Seeing Lacey on that footage cut deeper than any HOA letter or scratched truck ever could. The girl had once trusted him, smiled at him, and now Karen had twisted even that. By dawn, he was already outside, running maintenance on his backyard motion lights and cameras. This time, he hardwired a private security-grade system, completely off-grid. No Wi-Fi, no way to hack in. He wasn't playing defense anymore. And then he opened the Backup Plan folder. Inside were scanned copies of every notice Karen had ever sent him. Dozens of them. All time-stamped, cataloged, and matched against HOA bylaws. Many of them were invalid. Some were outright fabrications. He even had audio clips. Karen caught bragging to her girlfriends about teaching the old cop a lesson and slapping fines on him till he moved out. It was enough to take her down legally. But that wasn't enough. Not for what she'd just done. So Calvin made one more call, not to Henry Langford, not to Captain Brooks. He called Aisha Moore, a civil rights lawyer who owed him a favor from a case he once quietly buried to protect her family. She didn't ask questions, just said, "Email me everything." And then Calvin got to work. He printed flyers, nothing dramatic. Just plain black text on white paper. Do you know what your HOA is hiding? Join us Friday at 6 p.m., community meeting, my backyard. Anonymous testimonies welcome. No cameras, just truth. He slipped them into mailboxes early in the morning before most folks had even brewed their coffee. Then he sat back and waited. And Friday came. One by one, neighbors filed into his yard, most of them nervous, clutching their own stories. Mr. Lyle, Jenny from across the street, a couple who had lived quietly in the cul-de-sac for 10 years. Even the new guy, Troy, who had just moved in and already gotten 3 notices for offensive Christmas decorations in July. They all sat in lawn chairs or leaned on the fence. Calvin waited until the hush settled. Then he stood up and said simply, "I didn't call you here to start a riot. I called you here because I think you deserve to know what's really going on." He didn't show videos, no theatrics, just his voice, calm and clear. He told them about the trespassing, the harassment, the fines that didn't exist, the letters that weren't approved, the falsified paperwork, the targeting. And when he mentioned Lacey, the crowd shifted. Someone whispered, "That's too far." When it was over, he opened the floor. Jenny stood up first. "Karen fined me $200 for planting sunflowers." Mr. Lyle added, "She said my wind chimes were a nuisance to the community spirit." Even Troy stepped up. "She told me I needed to repaint my garage door because it didn't blend in with neighborhood values." People began to laugh, but it wasn't joyful. It was the kind of laugh that came from shared pain, from realizing they weren't alone. And just when things were calming down, Karen showed up. Right through the side gate she once kicked in, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand like a badge of honor. She didn't smile. "What is this?" she asked sharply. Calvin stepped forward, standing between her and the others. "Community meeting. You're welcome to stay." She looked around. Faces that used to smile at her were cold now. Distant. She tightened her grip on the clipboard. This is illegal. Unauthorized gatherings require board approval. You're all violating. We're off the clock, Mr. Lyle said, surprisingly firm. Jenny added, We're just talking. Isn't that what neighbors do? Karen's mouth twitched. The words caught in her throat. She turned toward Calvin. You've gone too far. He didn't blink. So have you. She took one step forward. You think this is over? That you've won? I think you should go home, Karen, he said calmly. While you still have one. She looked around again, at the silence, the eyes watching her. And then, slowly, she stepped back through the gate. But not before locking eyes with Calvin one last time. It was the kind of look people give before they do something they can't undo. And that something came the next morning. Calvin woke to the sound of shattering glass. He grabbed his flashlight and gun, heart racing, not because he was scared, but because he knew who it had to be. He moved room by room, clearing corners like muscle memory. When he reached the living room, the floor was covered in shards. His front window had been smashed, and on the floor, lying in the mess, was a brick wrapped in fabric. He picked it up slowly, unwrapped it. A note fell out. You want war? Let's go. No name. But he didn't need one. And just as he turned to call the police, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered, and what he heard made him freeze. It wasn't Karen. It was a voice far colder. We warned you to stay out of this, Officer Jenkins. Now your neighbors will learn what silence costs. Then the line went dead. And Calvin knew. Karen wasn't alone anymore. Calvin stood in the middle of the glass-strewn floor, gripping the phone so tight his knuckles turned pale. The voice had been unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just Karen anymore. Somebody else had skin in this game. The brick, the threat, the veiled warning. It all pointed to something bigger than petty HOA fines and pool trespassing. Someone wanted him silenced, not just embarrassed or pushed out, but erased from the fight altogether. He picked up the brick again, inspected the edges. Industrial. Heavy. Likely from a construction site. The fabric? Expensive. Silk blend. Someone wanted this to feel like a message, not a random act. He didn't waste time. He dialed Captain Brooks. Jenkins, Brooks answered groggily, voice barely awake. I need a trace on a call that hit my line at 2:13 a.m., blocked number. Threatened my life and my neighbors. Brooks was silent for a beat. I'll get on it. You want backup? Not yet, Calvin replied, but I want you on standby. He ended the call, cleaned up the glass, and loaded a few files onto a flash drive, the one marked Langford. Then he slid it into an envelope, sealed it tight, and walked across the street just after sunrise. Henry Langford was already outside, dressed like he had slept in his suit, sipping espresso like it was water. Told you she'd escalate, Henry said, not surprised to see Calvin. Calvin handed him the envelope. You were right, but I think we've got bigger problems. Langford raised an eyebrow as he opened the seal and scanned the first few pages. When he got to the letter attached to the brick, his face went pale. Who else knows about this? Just you, me, and Brooks. For now. Langford looked around carefully, then lowered his voice. There's a private development firm out of Florida, Rosemark Holdings. They've been quietly buying up HOA-run neighborhoods across the South. Maple Grove is next on their list. Calvin leaned in, jaw tightening. What does that have to do with Karen? Langford exhaled slowly. They recruit people like her, people who like power but don't understand limits. They put them on the board, let them harass the residents, drive down property value, and then swoop in and buy everything at half price. Cheap land, prime locations. It's a hostile takeover in khakis. Calvin took a moment to process that. So Karen's a puppet. Langford shook his head. More like a volunteer. But they're watching her now, and when she fails, they'll burn her just to protect their brand. Calvin clenched his fists. They threatened my life. Langford nodded grimly. That wasn't Karen, that was Rosemark. And just then, as if fate wanted to throw in one more twist, Calvin's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a blocked number, it was Jenny. He picked up quickly. What's wrong? Someone just showed up at my door, she said, her voice trembling. They said they were with HOA compliance enforcement. But we don't have that, do we? No, we don't, Calvin said, already heading for his truck. They tried to take pictures of my backyard, Jenny continued. When I asked for ID, they just left. Stay inside, lock your doors. He hung up and peeled out of his driveway, heart pounding. When he got to Jenny's, he was too late. The SUV was gone, but in its place, on her lawn, was another message, a fake violation notice, big red letters, official-looking seal. Code violation, property under probationary observation. Total nonsense. And at the bottom? Final warning to neighbors who side with Calvin Jenkins. He snatched the paper and stormed back to his truck. This wasn't fear-mongering anymore. It was psychological warfare. He spent the rest of the day visiting every neighbor who had shown up to the meeting, checked on their homes, warned them, gave them printed breakdowns of their rights, shared emergency numbers. He made sure they knew they weren't alone. But fear spread faster than flyers. By evening, 5 of the neighbors who had once stood proudly with him had gone quiet, closed blinds, canceled coffee invites, avoided eye contact. Karen was losing the battle, but Rosemark was winning the war. Then, just after 9 p.m., a car pulled into Calvin's driveway. It wasn't a friend. It was Lacey, alone. She stepped out slowly, hoodie up, hands shaking. Calvin met her halfway. I'm sorry, she said softly, eyes rimmed with tears. I didn't want to do any of this. She made me. She said if I didn't help, she'd send me away. Back to my dad's. Calvin didn't speak, just listened. She gave me keys, said the cameras weren't real, told me to take something from your garage, make it look like you were planning something illegal. I couldn't do it, I swear. Calvin looked into her eyes. They were wide, honest, full of regret. Why come now? Because she's planning something tomorrow, something big, and I think she's gone too far this time. What is she planning? Lacey hesitated. She said they were going to vote you out. Illegally. Fake meeting. No notice. They already signed the papers. They're going to say you threatened her, that you attacked her when she came to the pool. Calvin took a slow breath. She's going to lie to the police? She already did, Lacey whispered. I heard her. She made the call. Calvin's blood ran cold. If Karen had already filed a report, the next knock on his door could be the sheriff's department. This was it, the final move. She was going to try to have him arrested, discredited, and possibly removed from the neighborhood entirely. But what Karen didn't know was that Calvin still had one last piece of evidence, something he hadn't shared with anyone, not even Brooks. The night she broke in the second time, Calvin's off-grid backup camera had caught more than just her floating in the pool. It had recorded audio. And in that audio, Karen had said, clear as day, let him call the cops. I've got them in my pocket. This is my neighborhood now. Calvin backed up the clip onto 5 separate drives. Then he picked up the phone. Brooks, he said, I'm sending you something. This ends tomorrow, one way or another. The sun rose slowly over Maple Grove, casting a golden light across manicured lawns and spotless driveways. But there was nothing peaceful about the energy in the neighborhood that morning. At exactly 10:01 a.m., HOA board members began arriving at the community clubhouse. Karen was the last to step out of her car. Dressed sharply in a cream blazer, hair curled to perfection, she strutted inside like a queen returning to her throne. Her eyes were gleaming, dangerously. Inside the clubhouse, a long table had been set up. 5 seats, a few files, and one fake agenda. This wasn't a real HOA meeting. It was a setup. A private vote meant to strip Calvin of his homeowner rights, ban him from attending future gatherings, and smear his name across every neighbor's inbox by noon. Only problem? Calvin knew. Across the street, in his house, Calvin calmly zipped up his jacket, clipped on his old police badge, not for show but for what was coming next, and slipped a tiny recorder into his front pocket. He walked out the door with Duke trotting at his side, the massive Great Dane sensing something in the air. Halfway to the clubhouse, he was joined by Jenny, Mr. Lyle, and Troy. None of them said a word. They didn't need to. At the door, Calvin stopped and looked back once. A small crowd had gathered behind him. More neighbors. Faces once afraid now stood firm. People were tired of the fear, tired of the silence. He pushed the door open. Inside, Karen looked up, startled, but she recovered quickly. "This is a private session," she said, standing. Calvin walked to the center of the room, placed a single flash drive on the table, and calmly said, "Play it." One of the board members reached for it hesitantly. Karen's voice turned sharp. "Don't touch that." But it was too late. The board member inserted the drive into the laptop, and then Karen's voice filled the room, clear, unfiltered, unmistakable. "Let him call the cops. I've got them in my pocket. This is my neighborhood now." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's face drained of all color. Her hands trembled. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then Calvin pulled out his phone, tapped once, and the doors of the clubhouse swung open. Captain Brooks entered with 2 officers at his side. Behind them, Aisha Moore in a tailored navy suit, briefcase in hand, and Henry Langford looking more smug than ever. "Karen Whitmore," Brooks said, "you're being placed under arrest for filing a false police report, trespassing, and attempted property fraud." "No, no!" Karen shrieked, backing away. "You don't get to do this. I run this neighborhood." Aisha stepped forward. "Not anymore. As of this morning, a cease and desist was issued against the HOA under your leadership. An emergency election will be held next week." Karen lunged at Calvin, wild-eyed. "This is your fault. You think you're better than everyone?" Calvin didn't move, just looked her in the eye. "No," he said, "I just believe in justice." The officers cuffed her hands and began leading her away as she kicked and screamed. And then, another twist. A silver BMW screeched to a stop outside the clubhouse. A man jumped out, mid-40s, sharp jawline, Bluetooth in his ear. He stormed inside. "Karen, what did you do?" Everyone turned. Karen froze. "Brad," she whispered. "Rosemark Holdings just cut all ties with you," the man barked. "You were warned to keep it clean. Now they've got your name, your face, your lies, everything, on recorded audio. You just blew a $12 million deal." Karen's mouth dropped. "You said they'd protect me." "They were never here for you," he said coldly. "You were just leverage." With that, he turned and left. And Karen? She didn't scream anymore. She just wept. Later that afternoon, the neighbors held a real meeting. This time, in Calvin's backyard. No secret votes, no threats, just people talking. Freely, finally. Aisha announced that legal reforms were underway to prevent future board abuse. Langford promised to stay and help restructure the HOA entirely. Captain Brooks, sipping lemonade, gave Calvin a quiet nod before heading out. But the best moment? Lacey walked up to Calvin holding a box. Inside? The last of the HOA files from Karen's garage. Documents that proved everything. Kickbacks, forged signatures, even HOA funds being funneled into a personal vacation account. "You sure you want to give me this?" Calvin asked gently. Lacey looked him in the eye. "I want to live in a neighborhood where people feel safe." He nodded. And as the sun dipped low and music played softly from someone's speaker, Calvin sat in a lawn chair, Duke resting by his feet, neighbors laughing all around. Not because everything was perfect, but because, for once, it was right. And Karen? She watched it all unfold from the back of a squad car as it pulled away, screaming into the wind that the neighborhood would pay for this. But the only thing anyone heard was the sound of freedom settling in.